What's up? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And I think we're in chapter 3, about halfway through, going to finish it up. If you like the episode, if you like the show, hit that like and subscribe button. Let's just dig right in. Settler colonialism and the Ulster-Scots. The core group of frontier settlers were the Ulster-Scots, the Scots-Irish, or Scotch-Irish as they called themselves. Usually the descendants of these Scots-Irish say their ancestors came to the British colonies from Ireland, but their journey was more circuitous than that. The Scots-Irish were Protestants from Scotland who were recruited by the British as settlers in the 6 counties of the province of Ulster in Northern Ireland. The British had seized these 500,000 acres from Ireland in the early 17th century, driven the indigenous Irish farmers from it, and opened it to settlement under English protection. This coincided with the English plantation of 2 colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America and the beginning of settler colonialism there. These early settlers came mostly from the Scottish lowlands. Scotland itself, along with Wales, had preceded Ireland as colonial notches in the belt of English expansion. Britain's colonization of indigenous lands in North America was foreshadowed by its colonization of Northern Ireland. By 1630, the new settlers in Ulster, 21,000 Britons, including some Welsh and 150,000 lowland Scots, were more numerous than British settlers in all of North America at that time. In 1641, the indigenous Irish rebelled and killed 10,000 of the settlers, yet Protestant Scots settlers continued to pour in. In some, they must not have had CNN back in those days. Sorry, bad joke. In some formerly Irish areas, they formed a majority of the population. They brought with them the Covenant ideology of Calvinism that had been the work of the Scotsman John Knox. Later, John Locke, also a Scot, would secularize the Covenant idea into a contract, the social contract, whereby individuals sacrifice their liberty only through consent. An insidiously effective example, the U.S. economic system, was based on Locke's theories. So it was that the Ulster-Scots were already seasoned settler colonialists before they began to fill the ranks of settlers streaming toward the North American British colonies in the early 18th century, many of them as indentured servants. Before ever meeting indigenous Americans, the Ulster settlers had perfected scalping for bounty, using the indigenous Irish as their victims. As this chapter and the following one show, The Scots-Irish were the foot soldiers of British empire building, and they and their descendants formed the shock troops of the westward movement. In North America, the expansion of the U.S. continental empire and the colonization of its inhabitants. As Calvinists, mostly Presbyterian, they added to and transformed the Calvinism of the earlier Puritan settlers into the unique ideology of the U.S. settler class. In one of history's great migrations, nearly 250,000 Scots-Irish left Ulster for British North America between 1717 and 1773. About what? Oh, 1775, excuse me. That's what? 58 years? Although a number left for religious reasons, the majority were losers in the struggle over Britain's Irish policies, which brought economic ruin to Ireland's wool and linen industries. Hard times were magnified by prolonged drought, and so the settlers pulled up stakes and moved across the Atlantic. This is a story that would repeat itself time and time again in settler treks across North America, the majority of migrants ending up landless losers in the monopoly game of European settler colonialism. The majority of Ulster-Scots settlers were cash poor and had to indenture themselves to pay for their passage to North America. Once settled, they came to predominate as soldier settlers. Most initially landed in Pennsylvania, but large numbers soon migrated to the southern colonies and to the backcountry. The British colonies' western borders, where they squatted on unceded indigenous lands. Among frontier settlers, Scots-Irish predominated among settlers of English and German descent. Although the majority remained landless and poor, some became merchants and owners of plantations worked by slaves, as well as politically powerful. 17 presidents of the United States have been of Ulster-Scots lineage, from Andrew Jackson, founder of the Democratic Party, to Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama on his mother's side. Theodore Roosevelt characterized his Scots-Irish ancestors. By the way, I noticed that there was only Andrew Jackson up until fairly recently. And then, like, all of the they were all recent. Huh. What's going on there? Theodore Roosevelt characterized his Scots-Irish ancestors. See, it didn't mention Theodore Roosevelt, but now it does. As a stern, virile, bold, and hardy people who formed the kernel of that American stock, who were the pioneers of our people in the march westwards. Perhaps as influential as their being presidents, educators, and businessmen, the Scots-Irish engendered a strong set of individualist values that included the sanctity of glory in warfare. They made up the officer corps and were soldiers of the regular army, as well as the frontier-ranging militias that cleared areas for settlement by exterminating indigenous farmers and destroying their towns. The 7 Years' War between the British and the French, 1754 to 1763, which is actually 9 years, was fought both in Europe and in North America, where the British colonists called it the French and Indian War, because it was mainly a British war against the indigenous peoples, some of whom formed alliances with the French. The British colonial militias consisted largely of frontier Scots-Irish settlers who wanted access to indigenous farmland in the Ohio Valley region. By the time of U.S. independence, Ulster-Scots made up 15% of the population of the 13 colonies, and most were clustered in majority numbers in the back country. During the war for settler independence from Britain, most settlers who had emigrated directly from Scotland remained loyal to the British Crown and fought on that side. In contrast, the Scots-Irish were in the forefront of the struggle for independence and formed the backbone of Washington's fighting forces. Most of the names of soldiers at Valley Forge were Scots-Irish. They saw themselves, and their descendants see themselves, as the true and authentic patriots, the ones who spilled rivers of blood to secure independence and to acquire indigenous lands, gaining blood rights to the latter as they left bloody footprints across the continent. There's something to brag about. During the last 2 decades of the 18th century, first and second generation Scots-Irish continued to pour westward into the Ohio Valley region, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They were the largest ethnic group in the westward migration, and they maintained many of their Scots-Irish ways. They tended to move 3 or 4 times, acquiring and losing land before settling at least somewhat permanently. Scots-Irish settlers were overwhelmingly farmers rather than explorers or fur traders. They cleared forests, built log cabins, and killed Indians, forming a human wall of colonization for the new United States, and in wartime employing their fighting skills effectively. Historian Carl Degler writes that these hardy, God-fearing Calvinists made themselves into a veritable human shield of colonial civilization. The next chapter explores the kind of counterinsurgent warfare they perfected, which formed the basis of U.S. militarism into the 21st century. The Calvinist religion of the Scots-Irish, Presbyterianism, was in numbers of faithful soon second only to those of New England's Congregationalist Church. But on the frontier, Scots-Irish devotion to the formal Presbyterian Church waned. New evangelical offshoots refashioned Calvinist doctrines to decentralize and do away with the Presbyterian hierarchy, although they continued to regard themselves as chosen people of the covenant, commanded by God to go into the wilderness to build the new Israel. The Scots-Irish also saw themselves, as their descendants see themselves, as the true and authentic patriots, entitled to the land through their blood sacrifice. Didn't it already say that? Like word for word? Sacred land. Excuse me. I think I swallowed wrong. Sacred land becomes real estate. The land won through North American bloodshed was not necessarily conceived in terms of particular parcels for a farm that would be passed down through generations. Most of the settlers who fought for it kept moving on nearly every generation. In the South, many lost their holdings to land companies that then sold it to planters seeking to increase the size of their slave-worked plantations. Without the unpaid forced labor of enslaved Africans, a farmer growing cash crops could not compete on the market. Once in the hands of settlers, the land itself was no longer sacred, as it had been for the indigenous. Rather, it was private property, a commodity to be acquired and sold, every man a possible king, or at least wealthy. Later, when Anglo-Americans had occupied the continent and urbanized much of it, This quest for land and the sanctity of private property were reduced to a lot with a house on it, and the land came to mean the country, the flag, the military, as in the land of the free, or the national anthem of the national anthem, or Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land." Those who died fighting in foreign wars were said to have sacrificed their lives to protect this land that the old settlers had spilled blood to acquire. The blood spilled was largely indigenous. These then were the settlers upon which the national myths are based, the ultimately dispensable cannon fodder for the taking of the land and the continent, the foot soldiers of empire, the yeoman farmers, romanticized by Thomas Jefferson. They were not of the ruling class, although a few slipped through and later were drawn in by the ruling class as elected officials and military officers, thereby maintaining the facade of a classless society and a democratic empire. The founders were English patricians, slave owners, large land barons, or otherwise successful businessmen dependent on the slave trade and exports produced by enslaved Africans and on property sales. When descendants of the settler class, overwhelmingly Presbyterian or otherwise Calvinist Protestant, were accepted into the ruling class, they usually became Episcopalians, members of an elite church linked to the State Church of England. As we look at the bloody deeds of the settlers in acquiring and maintaining land, the social class context is an essential element. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 3. Thanks for joining me. Hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.